the problem that BFO 2020 was trying to solve was a problem with the OWL treatment of relations. And as you all know, OWL treats only binary relations. And when we are dealing with relations between, for instance, machines and machine parts, then we're dealing with ternary relations because parts can be replaced in a machine from one time to the next. And so we can't say that machine A has part gadget B without having some kind of temporalized index. When we created BFO 2.1, we did not solve this problem. We just allowed people to use BFO ternary relations as if they were binary relations. And that just brushed the problem under the carpet. So BFO 2.1 became BFO 2020, not in that there were any changes in the content, that those changes are quite small, nor in that there were any changes to the definitions of the terms. The changes there are almost all of them very, very tiny improvements. Then there are no major changes to definitions. The changes were overwhelmingly changes in the way relations were treated, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So let's take an example, and we'll just use has part. In fact, for BFO, you have a has continuant part, has a current part, but for the sake of this example, I'll keep the wording simple. So the problem is transitivity. If we have a machine of type A that has a part, which is a gadget of type B, and if every gadget of type B has a part, which is a widget of type C, then by transitivity, and quite reasonably, we will want to infer that every machine of type A has a part, widget of type C. And so we're talking about working machines here. We're not talking about machines as they exist when they're broken or when they're broken down into their parts. Now, the problem that I'm going to talk about now only arises for relations between continuant parts or between continuants. All relations involving continuants can have this problem. So not just parthood relations, but also other kinds of relations such as adjacency and so forth. And so the problem arises as follows. In OWL, and I believe this is quite correct, this is the way OWL works, and there's nothing wrong with it. What we mean when we say a machine of type A has part a gadget of type B, which is what the ontology will consist in, sentences like that. What we're actually doing is talking about instances of the type A and the type B. And what we're saying is that given any A, any little a of type big A, there is some little b of type big B, such that A has instance level part B. So this particular machine has a widget of type B, which is this particular widget B. Every type exists only through its instances, and OWL is about the relations between those instances. Now, all of these assertions, as I've put them on the screen here, are atemporal. But of course, in real life, there is always a time index. And now when we do the transitivity inference, we get this. For any A of type C, there is some C of type C such that A has instance level part C. And this is not in general true, because we will change gadgets in A at regular intervals, and we will change widgets in those gadgets at other regular intervals. And it's very unlikely that there will be a single widget which sticks with the machine A from the beginning of A's existence to the end of A's existence. Because the gadgets may be changed at different intervals from the widgets, it follows that there will typically, and certainly not logically necessarily, one single E that does the job of being the C widget at all working times. So that's the problem. This is a major problem for practically all OWL ontologies. BFO is the only ontology which has been addressing this problem. Dolce, OWL, Dolce Ultralight, and so forth did address the problem, did recognize the problem, but their solution is only a partial one.
So Barry, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
And when you go back to that slide, and so is there also an assumption that C sub 1 and C sub 2 are actually the same kind of C?
Yeah.
In other words, because in some cases it may be possible to replace C1 with C2, which is not really the same thing.
Yeah.
It does the same
So
function.
that can be dealt with already here. So if you're allowing your machine to have different types of gadgets which fill the C slot in the machine, then you would not assert working machine of type A has part working gadget of type C. You would have working gadget of type C1 or type C2 and so on. Okay. So these are meant to be universal, and that means you have to change them if you allow different types of gadgets to do this work.
Yeah, see, what I'm thinking is, if you think about like a CNC machine, you can, type C may be different types of bits and stuff like that, so they're not identical.
Yeah. No, that can be catered for, and it will have to be catered for each machine and for each gadget and each widget. So remember, what we're trying to do is to create the interoperable basis for software about everything which happens in an industrial enterprise. And that means for every single type of machine and for every single type of machine part, the specifications will be formalized using axioms like this.
Okay.
All right, so the problem arises only for OWL. It doesn't arise if you're using first order logic or common logic, because there you can have ternary relations and you can specify exactly what the restrictions are on your temporal replaceability. It arises for OWL because OWL only allows binary relations. We want to use OWL because only using OWL can we do inference in real time and check consistency in real time when we're applying the ontologies in industrial software. All right, so there are various solutions. BFO 2.0 was the first ontology which was correct. It didn't cause the problem. The problem is that it was very weak because we just removed all the problematic relations. And people didn't like that. BFO 2.1 puts the problematic relations back in with warnings. And the reader it's recommended of the reader that they realize that they are taking a certain risk in using these relations. And this risk arises relatively rarely in biology, but it does arise in biology in some cases. And the people who have those cases are aware of them, and they are very welcoming of what we've been doing with BFO 2020. But they arise a lot, I believe, in the industrial case, because there we have exchange of parts much more systematically. So, but BFO 2020 is a real solution to this problem. And now, just to repeat, you can't say A stands in relation to R to B at T in OWL because it's a ternary relation. And so what BFO 2020 does is that it binaryizes all the problematic relations. So all the relations involving continuants are binaryized in two forms. One form is the relation R holds at all times. One form is that relation R holds at some time. So A, R at all times, B, is still a binary relation. The problematic relations are not relations between processes. They are only relations where continuants are involved. All right, and now, what are the real practical solutions? I'm assuming that BFO 2020 has to be accepted by IOF. Otherwise, IOF will break every time people start replacing parts in machines. So we have to adopt BFO 2020. Actually, we'll have to adopt some parts of it because there is a very long list of relations in BFO 2020, each one of which appears in these two forms. Only some of them are actually going to be relevant for IOF. We choose the relations we need. We add more relations, which are specifications of the BFO relations for specific industrial purposes. And then we test them. We see whether there is a holds for all times condition satisfied for a given relation R. If it is satisfied, we can just use R. We don't need to say R at all times. We can just use a relation R because R holds for all times, if it holds at all. If it doesn't hold at all times, we can safely use R at some time. And so that never causes problems, but it gives you a weaker possibility of doing reasoning because you can't use transitivity. Now, another solution is that very often you can create an at all times relation if you switch the order. So it's not true that every working machine of type A has some single working widget of type C through the whole of its life, but it may very well be true that every widget of type C is part of the same working machine through all its life, because no one would ever think about moving a widget from one machine to another because it's just too much work, because to take the widget out and move it causes damage to the widget or takes more time and costs more than buying a new widget. So there might very well be, as there are in biology, incidentally, very many cases where you can use just R, mean R at all times, but you have to use R pointing in the right direction. And then a third possibility is that you introduce both relations, but you choose which one you should use from case to case. So rather than always using R at all times, because you know it's always true R holds at all times, you check for any given time whether R is true and use R at all times when it is true, and otherwise use R at some times. And then the final solution is to work out when R holds at all times. And this is actually also a solution which is being implemented currently by biologists with some success. So it may be true that every machine of type A has a single gadget of type B, which is its B part at all times. But it may be true, and it probably is trivially true, that every machine has a single initial part, which is a gadget B. And so there may be other conditions that you can formulate which guarantee that the relation in question holds at all times. And then you, again, whenever you can guarantee that it holds at all times, you can ignore the at all times phrase and just use the word R, if you wish. Okay, so that's the end. Are there any questions?
Barry,
Yeah.
this is, I have a question. So, what does it bias in terms of the inference for the use of R at sometimes? Because, like, in the previous example, we weren't able to infer, right? That
Yeah.
Gadget C, yeah.
Yes, so There are very many users of BFO ontologies who are involved also in working on statistical relations or NLP relations. So people who use BFO to support NLP are quite happy to have lots of at-sometimes relations. They don't use it for logical reasoning of the sort that we are primarily interested in, but they use it for other purposes. And so it's good to have the expressivity of R at sometimes, but as you say, it's very rarely going to give you any reasoning power.
So you mean like those people are using like a fuzzy reasoning, and that's why they use this? Okay.
So Barry, in terms of an interesting thing you brought up was the fact of, looking at the condition in the reverse order. So, unfortunately, when I think about it, it becomes a matter of, that C is used in something. In other words, I have a machine in which I have some interchangeable parts. Let's say it's a CNC machine, and for the most part, the machine is always the same machine, except that I can put different types of part C on that machine to get different functions. So, in looking at it from that reverse, but we don't have this kind of relationship. C is used, you have a condition that this part C, this widget, whatever it is used by that machine or used on the machine or whatever you want to say. Does that help in any way to resolve the multiple relation problem?
So, as I say, switching the order can very often be used to solve the multiple relation problem. You just have to instruct your users always to use the C part of A relation rather than the A has part C relation. Part of and has part are two different relations.
Okay.
This is something that was not recognized by ontologists when we started in around about the year 2000. The gene ontology did not recognize that there were two distinct relations here. They just assumed that wherever A is part of B, it follows that B has part A, but that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Barry, you said something earlier that these temporalized relations never applied between two processes, right?
Yeah. The problem doesn't arise between processes because process assertions are assumed to be made atemporally from a God's eye view. So if this process follows that process, it can never be the case that this process does not follow that process at some other time. Mm-hmm. We're already talking about the single time order when we talk about follows or precedes or is simultaneous with.
Yeah, but because in this occurrent temporalized thing, so there is a flow.
Yeah.
That we let's say we represent by what we call time, etc. So it can happen, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in engineering domain, a lot of relations are, at some time, but it's kind of useless without, the specific time period where at which time period this thing is part of the other thing.
So I think one of the things which we will be exploring under solution 2 on this screen here is finding ways of capturing those time period conditions and building them into the relations. And I'm just not able to think through some of the examples as well as the other people on this call will be, but I'm sure that there are, in maintenance, for instance, different conditions which we can identify and which we can then specify using not the at times or the at sometimes or at all times constraints on a relation, but rather using the under conditions C constraints on a relation. And then we can get an all times validity under a given condition. And then we can reason, again, for the all times case, which is, as you say, sir, the condition which is where we can actually do some real inferential work. We just need to work out what the conditions are. So we will be the first group to test how powerful the R at all times, R at sometimes approach can be. But we don't have any choice. This is the only documented, proven way of using OWL to talk about continuants.
Barry, so R at all times, I think it's clear. So it's all is defined. It's all times.
Yeah.
But the sum in R at sometimes, sum can be defined. So this
Sum means just
times
at
this
least
sum.
one.
At least one. Okay. I see. Yes.
So Barry, how does, if you have A has initial part gadget B at T0, but at T1 it's been changed out, how do we know that that has occurred from the instance standpoint?
Okay, so again, we're going to have to work out what works here, but let's suppose that parts can be replaced in a machine only through a maintenance operation. Then we would have two parts of the history of the machine, namely pre-first maintenance and post-first maintenance. And then we can say at all times pre-first maintenance, it's the same gadget in B in A as the initial B in A. So we can have an axiom to that effect. And then we might have special kinds of maintenance. So we might have maintenance which is just inspective maintenance or just polishing and cleaning. And then we have part replacing maintenance, which is of a special kind, has a special docket associated with it. And then we can say, if the machine A is still in the pre-replacement maintenance phase, then the B part of A is identical to the initial B part of A.
Okay, so if you're in the post-maintenance phase, then your query has to determine what B actually is at that point, correct?
Yeah, and I imagine that kind of information is maintained. So I imagine that in crucial cases, at least, when parts are replaced, then a record is made of that. And we need to have the ontology able to keep track of data about machines. Sorry, we need to keep track of data about machines using the ontology in such a way that we keep track of data about machine parts.
Okay.
There might be some room for fuzzy logic or some kind of stochastic reasoning. Once you have a machine which has gone through numbers of cycles of maintenance and changes of parts, and once you have many, many copies of that machine in different factories, then you can start to draw inferences about when is the likely first need to change a gadget which is a part of the machine. And for that, you need to collect lots and lots of information about the sometimes at which changes were made.
So if we have machine A, which in order to actually function, in other words, to be considered machine A, it has to have this part, this gadget B.
Yeah.
We're not saying the type of gadget B that it has to have, but it must have gadget B in order to be considered to be machine A. So then we simply need to identify what particular version of gadget B is on that machine or in that machine at time t whatever. Right?
So even here, you would still have the problem. So let's suppose you have a machine A, and it has part gadget type B1 when it's first built. And then in the typical case, it will always have a gadget type of B1. This is big B now, big B1 throughout its life. But then after 6 years, the gadget type B2 is invented. And everyone switches their machine A type to use B2 type gadgets because they're more efficient. Then you won't be able to make any inferences about the machines A having part gadget type B1 because everyone switched to B2. So the problem arises not just for instances of gadget of type B or B1 or B2, but also for subtypes B1, B2 of gadget supertype B.
Okay, I understand.
And I think this is going to be where things are going to be challenging for us, is that there's a lot of situations where it's not really maintenance, it's setup. And then the capability of the machine changes depending on what that setup is. And so there's a period of time in which that machine has certain capabilities because it has that setup. And when you change that setup, it's going to have others. So somehow we're going to have to be able to apply that temporal scope even given OWL.
Yeah. And so first of all, I think it's not only a problem for us. I'm assuming that the engineering companies that make the machines and the gadgets are going to provide the specifications of their machines and gadgets using OWL. And that's not a joke. So there are already steps in that direction, legal steps in the Air Force community to make that a requirement, because when the Air Force buys new equipment, they have a huge cost involved in working out how to make the new equipment work on the network digital level with the existing planes. And what they want is to have a logical solution to that problem, which means there has to be a lingua franca for specifying the connections, the capabilities of parts in such a way which is consistent with the way in which the planes themselves are specified. So the makers of parts are going to have more sophisticated specifications of their parts. That's the first step. But it is also a problem for us because we need to develop the ontologies which can cope with those specifications.
Hey, so Barry, even when we introduce related temporal relations such as coincides, we also then would have to temporalize them by saying coincides at all times or coincides at some times, right?
Actually, no. So if a process, if we have an ontological assertion, it will be about process types, not about process instances. What we say is not that some process instances coincide at all times with some other process instances. Rather, we say, I have to think this through while I'm talking. Hang on.
I tell you what, let's just do it offline because we're about to enter that domain with the supply chain.
But anyway, we do not need to binaryize relations between processes. That's not the way to go. We can say what you want to say about coincidence without the need to binaryize the relations.
Okay.
Is there some basic place where I can look to better understand what you were talking about, this atemporal view that we have for occurrence?
Actually, yes, that was the very first publications on BFO years and years ago used to talk about two branches of BFO. We call them SNAP and SPAN. So the SPAN view is the view of occurrence. And the SNAP view is you take a photograph of a continuant. And The snap view it holds only at a moment because continuants are losing parts all the time. Remember, we were working in the area of biology, and people are losing molecules and cells constantly throughout their lives. So if you take a photograph and then take another photograph, there will be different material in the first photograph than in the second photograph, even though the same person is in this photograph.
But Barry, I think it's similar also in engineering, in manufacturing, in machines, for example.
Yeah.
Molecules we lose molecules because of degradation of our bodies.
Yeah,
the same in machines.
that's true. But
we
anyway,
we need maintenance because of degradation. It's more or less similar.
so the span view is the God's eye view. God sees all the processes. He doesn't have to see only what he can see now. He can see the whole history of the universe all in one go. So we call that the span view because it spans time. And the paper on BFO, which has been cited most often, is called Snap and Span. And it's all about Evan's question.
So Evan says
Thanks.
God.
Evan is God, is that the question?
No,
So I say, or you are the God. I don't know. So.
No, I'm God's mechanic.
Can I make another observation? It seems like some of the questions about this maintenance parts being changed. I would think that in the traditional like product lifecycle management system, it's dealt with the information entity side of thing. The notion of revisions, product revisions, are kept throughout the changes. It sounds like what you're trying to do here is trying to kind of reflect those information content directly on the continuant side. So I'm just wondering, can we not just reason about this part of based on the information content?
We're going to want to use part of reasoning. I don't know to what extent we're going to want to use part of reasoning. That remains to be seen. But we don't want to start building a huge structure of ontologies using part of reasoning and have a logic of part of which doesn't work. That would be too great a risk. I think you're right, Sam, that much of the reasoning will be at the level of information, including in connection with maintenance. But I have some experience working with maintenance ontology people in the Air Force, and they have huge problems with the information because the maintenance engineers, they typically fill in the reports at the end of the day when they want to go home. And so they very often don't describe exactly what they did, but rather they use things like other, or they fill in very sloppily the cells that they're supposed to fill in. And the Air Force, the people I was working with, were desperate to find ways of having some sort of ontology going on underneath their paperwork, which would avoid the problems which arise when the paperwork is filled in incomplete ways.
That's kind of pretty common problem, but garbage in, garbage out. If you put in garbage information, you get garbage reasoning.
So let's try not to put garbage in from the start when we come to building the ontologies.